Thank you all for coming, and thanks for the organization and the speakers that came before. It's going to be a task to follow them. So yes, I'm Ahmed. I work at Ubisoft. I'm a content director at the headquarters in Paris. And as mentioned, I've been doing interface development and design since 2005, so before I went to games. And I did some, so I started in making interfaces for Windows apps, trading software and things like that. And transitioned into mobile, doing design and coding for iOS. Back when the iPhone was new and there was a lot of money being spent on silly apps. So I did that and then transitioned into games. So I worked on a couple of games you might know, Killzone Shadowfall, which was a launch title for PS4. I don't recommend working on launch titles. It's a messy affair, don't do that. Worked on Horizon Zero Dawn, Battlefield, Star Wars, and recently I've been working on a bunch of games that are not out yet, but you'll see them come by later. So the last 3 years I've been at HQ as a content director, which means that I'm not just working on interface anymore, I'm working on game design as well and kind of the broader content that is in games. Apps in general, so the difference, a key difference between games and websites and apps and things that you interact with in your day-to-day is that in most of these applications, the interface is your whole product. It's what you buy or what you use. In games, we of course have something else, which is the game itself, and we add an interface on top of that game. So here you can see, for instance, how HUD is overlaid in screen space over a game. And of course, you have other interfaces in games, which are ones you see, menus where you can interact with the game systems or the meta systems that the game has. So this talk, what I'm going to talk about is a problem that I've seen in our industry, or that's very prevalent in our industry, which is that the game comes first. The people set out the direction for the game, and then we come late and try to make sense of it and try to design an interface that solves all the problems that the game puts in front of us. So in this talk, I'm going to try to use psychology or human interaction psychology to try to bridge that gap a bit and find the commonalities between what's in the game world and what's on the interface. So specifically in psychology, I'm going to talk about a concept called presence. And in psychology, that's the definition is here on screen. So it's a psychological state or perception in which a person perceives an experience through technology. So, and this was a term coined by a man called Marvin Minsky, who's the co-founder of the AI lab at MIT. He coined this in the 80s, 1980, I think. And what it roughly, or a common application that you might know is if you are using the phone, if you're on the phone with somebody and you're closing your eyes, you can imagine yourself in a dark room talking to somebody. That's the feeling of presence, or that's the study of presence. It studies all the times when you filter input through technology. So there's many applications, like I said, a phone call has this, things like drones. If you control a drone, a flying drone on a screen, point of view screen, if you feel that you're flying, that's that feeling of presence. Things like avatars in games are, of course, a big part of that. So you can imagine that, or there's a specific anecdote that I want to bring up. In Metal Gear Solid 4, a famous game, the designers tried to make it so that when the player gets scarred, the scars stay on the player, on the character. And this was in test discovered to be it didn't test well. People didn't like it. People kept reloading their save games because they didn't want scars. And that's kind of how you can see how this feeling of presence in an avatar can actually transcend the screen. Another application, a common one, is something like a gacha machine or a toy grabbing machine. If you have infinite time and infinite coins, at some point this arm will become an extension of yours. And that's also the feeling of presence. So it also applies in robotics. It doesn't just apply in audiovisual technology, also in interactive technology like robotics. And what people study, who study presence, is so if on one side you have a real experience, like pinching yourself, that's a real thing you feel. And on the other you have a hallucination or a dream, something that you experience which is not real. Everything in the middle between those extremes they call virtual experiences, and that's what they study. And I'm personally not an expert in this, but you can read up on this. There's a lot of white papers that you can find online which are very interesting. If you are studying human-machine interaction, look it up and you'll find a lot of gold online. So presence, how does it get affected by features that we have in our games? And what I've done here is I've made a couple of lists of features or technologies that you might or might not know, and how they affect presence. So here on the left, I put all the features that are in Affinity with presence. So things that you might know like RTX, ray tracing, things like VR or adaptive triggers, spatial audio, things that increase your immersion or make you feel more present in that world. Those are all things in Affinity with it. There's also things that contrast it, things like clipping or frame drops, things that jar that feeling, or even things like having overlays over your screen. If you're playing a game and a pop-up comes on screen, that pulls you out of that experience. So the reason why I didn't say things that are good or bad for presence is because these are things that you can use, of course. Contrast is something that's against it, but it could be used. Maybe in an overlay like that, you're saying something very important that the player needs to read. So in that case, a contrast is something desirable. So that's why I use those words, just a detail. So when it comes to interfaces or game interfaces, how does that stack up in Affinity or at contrast with presence? So what I've done here is I've drawn from a thesis called Beyond the HUD. This is a thesis written by two students, and they wrote this in Stockholm. They were working at EA DICE at the time, working on Battlefield as part of their graduation project. And they came up with some terms that describe very well the types of UI that we have in games, in 3D games. So I'll cover that briefly so that you can know what kind of types of interface we have in games, and then I will talk about the psychology behind it. So what they said in their thesis is that there are 4 types of interface, and they've represented it in this model. So on one axis you can see interfaces that are projected in 3D or are overlaid in 2D over the 3D viewport. That's one axis. The other one is whether the interface is in the narrative of the game world or not. And I will show some examples, and you might recognize some of these things already, but here I'm just giving them a name so that you know how to talk about them. So the first I'm going to talk about is diegetic interfaces. And those are interfaces that are projected in the 3D world and are founded or grounded in the narrative of the game. And here are some examples that you might recognize. So you can see a game like Dead Space that has a weapon ammo counter on the gun. So the actual character in the world sees that interface as well as the player. Things like a motion detector in Alien Isolation, or a map that the character holds in a first-person game. These are all interfaces that are intended for the player, but they're also seen by the character or the avatar. So these are interfaces we call diegetic interfaces. Next up, we have meta interfaces. So they are still based in the narrative, but they are composited onto the viewport. So they are 2D on top of the viewport. And here are some examples of that, or 3D, but still composited. So you can see here, for instance, a lock-picking minigame, or the blood that you see around the screen when you're playing a first-person shooter. If a soldier gets shot, they don't see blood. But this is kind of a narrative representation of taking damage. So it's in the narrative, but it's projected onto the viewport. And same goes with a book that you see overlaid there. The character is not holding it. It's just a meta book. So those we call meta interfaces. Next up, we have spatial ones, which are projected in the game world, but are not in the narrative. And you can see some examples of that here, like, for instance, the listening effect or the sound effect in a game like Last of Us. It's an outline, a shaded outline around an enemy, which represents the player character hearing them. But, so that's a 3D projected interface that is not seen by the player character, so we call those spatial interfaces. Same goes with a health bar above an enemy, that's projected in 3D, but is not seen by the character. And then finally, we have abstract interfaces, which are the interfaces we all know and love. And it's kind of the same as a website or an app. These are interfaces that are not 3D, and they're also not seen by or not based in the narrative or seen by the characters in the game. So with those 4 types, we can reason about presence and how they affect the presence that the player experiences when they're playing our game. And I've made a cheat sheet here, so what you can see is, you can see that, of course, diegetic interfaces are most in affinity with the feeling of presence. And as we get further away from that immersion, we go through meta, spatial, and finally abstract interfaces. And what I've done here is I've also taken the liberty to kind of write a rule of thumb, which is which game loops we usually use these for. So for second-to-second gameplay, things that's very close to the gamepad or what you're trying to do in the game, it's best to use diegetic interfaces. And for things that you only interact with sparsely or maybe once every half hour, we tend to use abstract interfaces. So here you can see how, in a quick overview, how these interfaces line up with presence. So how do we bridge the gap between game design and interface design? So what we try to do as UX designers in the field is not be the UX police, not be the people that come in and tell the game designers what's right or wrong. We also try not to be the harbingers of truth. You know, game designers are also very good at understanding what the players need and want. So a great way to do that is by workshopping it. So if you have a bunch of features in a game that fall under an epic, so let's say your epic is combat in a game, you can have multiple features that fall under that, and each feature can have sub-features. What we do is we sit together with the designers and we workshop this. We try to get everyone to give their input. Which game loop is it a part of, the sub-feature? What's our intention? What's the design intent? And we collect all of this data to try to set a UX direction that is overlapping with the game direction or in line with it. That's kind of how we go about it. And what you get when you do that is you get these 4 lovely buckets. You get all the features that are diegetic together, all the features that are meta, spatial, and abstract. And you can make a big chart and put it on the wall and see the game holistically. And that's a very useful tool when talking to game designers and getting their input. And of course, the top 2 of these buckets can be written into the game or into the narrative. So people like writers and other people that are in charge of the narrative or the IP can take these features and preempt the solutions that will come into the game later by writing it into the story. That's kind of great to have. And of course, when new features come in, which they always do, you can take them and reason about them and put them into the right bucket at a high level before you even start working on them. And what that does is it prevents us from making games organically. We do it with a purpose. That's the key here. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about a couple of games that have features that look like this, and I'll show you how that looks, how an artifact like this looks. Here's a game called Ghost of Tsushima. I don't know if you've played it. It's a game made by Sony. It's an open world adventure game where you play a samurai. And in this game, there's a feature called the Guiding Wind. And that's was a very novel feature in UX design in games. In open world adventure games, usually navigation is done using location markers or a compass or a map, and I'll show you how that looks. And here's an example from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is a Ubisoft game. And you can see that location marker is something that is spatial usually, and the map is usually abstract. And here you can see a screenshot of the game, and you can see a compass and a location marker. So the location marker is usually projected in 3D. You see where you need to go, and a compass is kind of a mix between an abstract and a spatial interface. So these are very common paradigms that we use in UX design in games. But Ghost of Tsushima took that and flipped it around a bit. They took this feature called the Guiding Wind, which is a diegetic feature. And as you get closer, so when you get within 50 meters of your objective, that's when it turns into a location marker. And what they do there is they keep you in affinity with presence longer before they show a marker on screen. And that looks something like this. So you have the wind there, you see that's diegetic, it's in the world, it blows all the leaves, it blows your horse's mane. So it's in the world, and in the narrative, it is explained as to be the soul of your dead father who guides you through the world. So they really wrote it into the story and made sure that it's part of the narrative. And then when you get close, only then they show you a location marker. So this is a good example of a feature made for a specific game and how that shows on an artifact like this. Another example that I'll show is from a game called Shadow Gambit. This game came out last December and is a very cool game. And they have a feature called Capture Memories, which is practically a safe scumming feature. So in a lot of games where a single decision has very high impact on your game, people tend to do a lot of safe scumming. What that means is they save the game before they make a decision, and then afterwards, if they made the wrong decision, they load the game again. And in a game like Baldur's Gate, that's usually like an abstract interface. So you can see here's a situation, a failed dice roll. People will then go to the menu and load their game so that they can get the success. And this is called safe scumming. It's very common. People will always do it. And in Shadow Gambit, they did something really great, which is they took this feature and made it into a meta interface, which is capture, restore memories. And what they do is in the story, they wrote a narrative that your ship can capture your memories and transport you back into your memories. So before you make a decision, you can capture a memory, and then if you make the wrong one, you can load it back again. And this is pretty much a simple safe scumming feature, but then grounded in the narrative of the game. And that's a good example of how to use a model like this to improve your experience. So what I'll do next is show you like a quick case study that I've made myself. I just pulled some models off of TurboSquid and made some renders to show how this would work in practice. So I forgot who made this model, but I should have credited him. And so imagine we're making an open world game or an adventure game, a 3D adventure game. Here are a bunch of features that are common in an adventure game: a health system, a low health warning, a shield, loot, a skill tree, and an incoming threat. And what I've done here is I've taken the liberty to take these loops, either the second-to-second loop, minute-to-minute, 10-to-10-minute loop, or half-hour-to-half-hour loop, and I've assigned them to these features. And if you sketch that on an artifact like this, you can see how that looks approximately. So all the things related to the core gameplay, the health, the shield, the incoming threats, are high up, and the things like skill trees that you interact with very rarely are low down. And let's have a look on how that would look. So is that gonna start? There you go. So first, you can take the health system and put it on some capacitors, maybe on your 3D model. That's usually where the people look most of the time anyway. They look at the avatar that they control or at the center of the screen. You can take shields and also attach them there. You can make an incoming threat as part of an antenna interface to show where threats coming from. This is necessary in 3D games because you can get attacked from off-screen, from behind the camera. A low health warning you can do like in Call of Duty. You can do something that is narratively based but projected in 2D. Loot you can put spatially, which is something you interact with maybe every 15 minutes or every encounter. And then finally, a skill tree can be something that is abstract because you only see that maybe once every 20 minutes when you level up. So another thing you can do with a model like this is you can analyze your game. You can use either recordings or telemetry data to see if your intentions line up with what you designed. And this is also a common way to measure your work and make sure that it's in line with your expectations. So if you do a recording and or you do you gather some telemetry data and you see that a bunch of abstract UI is showing often in the game, then maybe that's a moment where you can reflect and see if you want to promote that into a different interface. So yeah, that's how we try to combine game design or let's say narrative in games and interface work. I hope you've taken something away from this and that you're interested in game development. If so, I'll be hanging around here so you can come talk to me about it. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. I'll be happy to answer.